are tracking developments in the trial of 3 Tacoma police officers in the death of Manuel Ellis. Thanks for joining us. I'm Christine Pay. Ellis died while being restrained by police in March of 2020. Officers Matthew Collins, Christopher Burbank, and Timothy Rankin are all facing charges in his death. King 5 is live streaming the entire trial from opening to closing statements. We take you now to the courtroom live.
The issue I wanted to raise is that we've advised the defense that we're anticipating playing the defendant's statements or presenting the defendant's statements later this week. And we have asked repeatedly about whether or not they want any redactions of the other ones, other co-defendant statements related to them, and consistent with Bruton. And we haven't gotten a response. And although I think that Mr. Osser has indicated that he doesn't have any redactions that he's requesting from the other defendant's statements. But we just need to know so that we don't have a delay. If there are redactions being requested to their co-defendant statements, we need to get those done so that we can play them this week.
Any Bruton issues for anybody?
Your Honor, I did respond in general, but we're happy to make those suggestions for redactions before the statements.
When do you want to use them?
Huh?
When do you want to use them?
Probably going to use them on Thursday, if not Wednesday afternoon.
All right.
So that's why we need to have them. We're not talking about, just so we're clear, because the response I received from defense counsel, from Ms. Bremner, was that they wanted redactions to her client's statement about content. And that's not what we're asking. We're asking about statements, each other's statements that refer to the co-defendant,
Right.
to her client.
We're happy to respond, Your Honor.
Good.
But we have a deadline for that because we keep asking.
What's that? It's on. Anyway, so the issue is when would you have a response?
End of the day today.
That work?
We'll have to make it work, yes,
Okay.
but we need it to end of the day.
Mr. Usser?
I think I told Ms. Nicolavo a week and a half ago I had no redactions, but I would request there are references in my client's statement to Mike Strapoli being present, who was the attorney for Mr. Collins at the time. Obviously, that would need to be redacted. Other than that, as it relates to Bruton, I don't have any issues. I think I communicated that some time ago.
My understanding was that the court said that obviously they can be there, we're just not going to refer to them as the lawyer for the client. But obviously, they had another person present with them, so.
Your Honor, I thought I said to Mr. Nicolavo last week, well, we don't have the objection, but we'll look at it one final time just to make sure that
Please,
we don't have it.
if you guys could all do that by the end of the day,
Yes, Your Honor.
great. And if there is going to be some redactions for Mr. Collins and Mr. Usser's client, it sounds like they're minor, whatever they might be.
I think he indicated there are going to be redactions.
Oh, no, all I'm saying is redact attorney for Officer Collins. I don't care if it says Mike Strapoli in there, just his attorney, the reference to attorney would be the only thing I would ask to be taken out, Judge.
Yeah, I guess the only difficulty I have to look at, Your Honor, is that these are audio recordings. So, that they're.
So does he introduce himself? I'm Mr. Collins' attorney, kind of thing?
I have to
Say
look
that
at
in
the
the statement.
statements again. I don't know if Mr. Osser remembers.
I have the statements right here, Judge. I think he just references, in parentheses, it says, Attorney Mike Staropoli. He says Mike Staropoli, yes you do, that sort of thing. So I think it's, and in the introductory paragraph it says, also present for the interview is Attorney Mike Staropoli. So that's the reference to attorney. So one on the recording, I think, and the other is just the transcriber indicating it's the attorney speaking.
You'll have to review what the audio actually says if that's what you're going to actually introduce.
Yeah, and I would just note if it just says attorney and it doesn't indicate who the attorney is for, I don't know that if the council still has the same concern that it's just a lawyer who's present.
Yeah.
And we have the same issue in our client's case.
Okay, well, if there's anything else, you guys work it out hopefully by the end of the day and we'll be set.
Your Honor, the other issue that I wanted to address before we brought out the jury is, as the court noted yesterday, There's several exhibits that Mr. Fredericks has gone through, and you noted that they were still conditionally admitted on at least one of them, and I wanted to cover that with the court today to see if there remains any issues, because I'd like to bring that up from the jury, that 19, 22, 23, 546, 434, 435, 437,
I don't think we conditionally introduced all of those.
and 438. I had those down as conditioned, and I want to make sure that they're not. And if they're not, that's great. I just want to make sure the record, I can clarify on my record then.
I only remember the one, to be honest with you, the one we talked about yesterday, and I can't remember what that number is now. Susan, you got a list that says something different.
I wasn't,
Conditionally admitted exhibits.
Tuesday,
Do we have one or more, or 5 or 6?
we have at least, I thought I had 2.
2, okay. Ms. Nikolova started to rattle off 8 or 9, and I stopped
Your Honor.
her.
And I suspect the conditionally admitted on 19, which was Cowden's, is removed because Mr. Cowden testified.
No, 19 still shows up for me.
What was the other one we talked about
The
yesterday?
other ones were 22,
No, start, so the 3-digit number, which was the one yesterday.
digit ones, Your Honor. 546, 434, 435, 437, and 438.
So Mrs. Winnie can check those quickly. Do you have any of them conditionally admitted? Well, 546, 434, and 435 were admitted subject to authentication by the witnesses. 437 was 2.
Four 34, 435, 437, 438 are all subject to authentication. You were correct, Bill. 22.
She's right, not me.
22 looks like it's already been admitted.
Yeah.
Okay.
22 and 23, I believe, when Ms. White testified, the court admitted those.
Okay.
Yeah, those are.
All right, at this point, I'll ask the defense, is there any continuing objection to 434, 435? 438, 437, or 546?
Your Honor, if I recall correctly, the only continuing objection, I think there was some cumulative objections at the time, but other than that, no additional objection.
Sorry, Judge, I'm trying to pull them all up.
Okay.
So is 546 on the conditional list?
I have it on my original list.
Yes?
And the state's still seeking to admit it?
Yeah, evidently. It was already admitted subject to authentication. I think the authentication has been completed now.
Judge, I've reviewed all of those, I don't have any objections.
I don't have any objection to that.
Okay, so 434, 435, 437, 438, and 546 were previously admitted. Authentication has been established.
Your Honor, wish to do that in front of the jury.
I don't think we need to. And then there was, and I agree with you, there was 19, 22, and 23 were the same thing.
Yes, Your Honor.
So I'm asking the defense, at this point, does anyone think those are still an issue? Mrs. Winnie, you have one?
I've got 22 being admitted.
No, I have them admitted subject to authentication. Seems to me they've been authenticated now. Any further objection?
No, Your Honor.
No objection.
Okay.
All right, so 19, 22, and 23 are also admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor.
As I say, they already were, but they've been authenticated, so they're no longer subject to that, to being unadmitted, if you will. Those are the ones I've got, at least that I can find. And I think that's it. Okay. Are we otherwise ready for the jury?
Judge, I just got an email that with some additional exhibits that I anticipate the state's going to use or try and use with a witness, and I figure I might as well address it now so we don't have to do it at the time.
Sure.
So I believe the state, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the state is going to try and call one of their investigators from the Attorney General's office to bring in the spit hood warnings and
Sorry, the spit hood what?
the warning label that
Oh.
is contained on the spit hood,
Yeah.
as well as the spit hood itself, or a version of the spit hood, a replica of what was used that night. Obviously, we have concerns with that. Number one is there's been no evidence whatsoever that the warning label was ever showed to our client or any of these defendants, for that matter. This court has already, I think, pointed out the fact that mens rea and knowledge is a huge portion of this case. So it's not, what happened, but whether they knew what was happening. So without any indication that this warning label had been provided to our client or the defendants, it's not relevant. And it's clearly being offered by their investigator for the truth of the matter asserted. That there's no foundation for it. She doesn't know how it was created, what the testing that was done in order to create it, and it's hearsay. So those are the three issues I wanted to raise with the court now.
Your Honor, the state will be calling Investigator Jackie Franklin from the Attorney General's office. She will testify regarding her efforts to identify the spit hood that was the manufacturer of the spit hood used in this case. She was able to find the manufacturer. She will indicate that the manufacturer provided her a sample of the spit hood that was used in this case, although a slightly different material color. But her testimony will be that she received it, took a photo of it, including the instructions. And she will indicate that the manufacturer indicated the instructions came with the package, and it was the same instructions that were supplied back in March of 2020. All of this is relevant, of course, to the issues in this case, and it ultimately goes to the weight, not the admissibility, but it is relevant.
Don't you have first of all, do you not already have the original spit hood?
We do, but we don't have the instructions that came with it, including the warning label. And we will have someone from the company itself come in to testify regarding the instructions as well. But Ms. Franklin is the one that took the photos of the instructions, and she will be able to identify it.
Okay, I believe that Dr. Mitchell touched upon this in his testimony. But isn't there the additional problem here that none of these defendants used the spit hood?
But ultimately, the spit hood was used, and ultimately, the instructions contained with the spit hood packaging contained instructions about how to use it, and it wasn't followed.
But wouldn't that be the responsibility of the officer who actually used it, who's not one of the defendants?
It doesn't, but it is relevant to this case and how it's used.
What? No, tell me how it's relevant. How does it tend to show a fact that's at issue in this case? To me, it's more of a defense kind of thing in a way, to be honest with you. I mean, the defendants could say, oh, those other officers shouldn't have used it. That's maybe what caused his death. We had nothing to do with it. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's what they're going to argue.
But the spit hood was supplied to all the officers at some point.
Well, yeah, but if I've got handcuffs and I never use them and somebody else does, how am I responsible for their use of the handcuffs? Just because I own handcuffs or know what they are.
But ultimately, whether the spit hood was used, how it was used on someone who was indicated to have trouble breathing is relevant in this case.
Answer that question, though, Mr. Liu. What fact does it tend to show in this case that needs to be shown?
The fact that this was a spit hood that was issued by the department to all the officers.
Yeah.
And circumstantially, I think they should be aware of the dangers of using a spit hood on someone who's indicating that they can't breathe or having trouble breathing. And the instructions also indicate that you shouldn't use it on someone who is bleeding, and which is the defendants were all aware of that.
Well, now, wait a minute. I'm not so sure. Is there any evidence that they were aware of that?
Well,
I thought there was evidence. I thought there was some information in the case that said none of the officers, none of the Tacoma Police Department officers at all, ever received training about the spit hood. Am I wrong about that?
There's no training provided on the use of spit hoods, but the spit hood itself has the instructions telling the officers or whoever's using it that they shouldn't use it on someone who's having trouble breathing or vomiting or bleeding.
Well, I believe it was the business about profusely bleeding, right?
Correct.
And didn't Dr. Mitchell say he was not profusely bleeding?
But the instruction does not indicate profusely bleeding. That profusely bleeding, I believe, is from one of the officers, that put the spit hood over Mr. Ellis's head. That was bleeding enough where it formed a hockey puck-sized pool of blood underneath him.
During cross-examination by Dr. Mitchell, he was asked about the spit hood manufacturer of disallowing use if the bleeding is profuse, and he said this was not profuse bleeding.
Nevertheless, Your Honor, this is Mr. Ellis was in the defendant's care and custody. They all have been issued this department issued spit hood that contains these warnings, this warning label that indicates spit hood should not be used on someone who.
But how are these officers responsible for the use of it by somebody else?
Because Mr. Ellis was in their care and custody. They were the defendants Collins and Burbank took control of Mr. Ellis, placed him in custody. Mr. Officer Rankin was on top of Mr. Rankin, or on top of Mr. Ellis for a long period of time. So all three of these officers were involved with restraining Mr. Ellis. And when that spit hood went over Mr. Ellis, they were all issued the spit hood. It was a department issued spit hood.
Sergeant Lynn was there, right?
Correct.
He would have seen all this.
Correct.
He would have been the officer in charge once he arrived, right?
He would have been.
Why hasn't he been charged?
Because these are the three defendants that took direct custody and control of Mr. Ellis.
Well, Sergeant Lynn took control of the scene and therefore of Mr. Ellis once he arrived, right?
But whether Sergeant Lynn is charged or not is not at issue here. What is at issue here is these three defendants and their knowledge of Mr. Ellis' condition and whether the spit hood should have gone on Mr. Ellis and whether it should have remained on Mr. Ellis. And based on the packaging and the warning label on the spit hood, they shouldn't have.
But you've got no evidence that they ever saw it.
We have circumstantial evidence that they saw it, that they know the spit was on them.
What's that?
The spit hood was on Mr. Ellis throughout the entire incident until fire arrived. And the spit hood was removed only once fire arrived.
Well,
And we know all three of the defendants were at the scene until fire arrived.
we know that the spit hood was not on Mr. Ellis throughout the entire episode, as you've just said. It was on Mr. Ellis after he was handcuffed by at least Burbank and Collins, and they had stepped aside. Right,
They
so,
stepped aside, but they're still at the scene.
yeah, but you're saying that they're responsible for him, even for the care of him by other people after that?
Yes.
And what's your legal basis for that?
Mr. Ellis was in their custody and control. Burbank and Collins were the officers that placed him into custody, arrested him.
So when Sergeant Lim arrived, could they have done anything differently from what he wanted them to do? If they said, take the spit hood off, and Lim said, leave it on, did they have the authority to do that?
We have no evidence that occurred in this case.
No, I'm trying to determine who's responsible at what point in time. You're trying to make them responsible for the actions of other officers that arrived after they essentially had nothing more to do with it, or at least Collins and Burbank. I don't know about Rankine.
Because they're the ones that initiated the contact with Mr. Ellis.
So they're responsible for everything else that happens after that?
They were still at the scene. They have a caregiving function. Once they placed Mr. Ellis under arrest, they were the ones that placed him under arrest, and they were still at the scene. They had a duty of custodial care. Mr. Ellis was under their duty. And we also have statements from them that they acknowledge that they knew of the hood, and Officer Burbank looked for a spit hood.
But he didn't put one on him.
Certainly, there's knowledge there that the spit hood was on. There was a search for a spit hood. And there
But my question was the knowledge of not so much that the spit hood existed, but of what the warnings were.
the warnings came with a packaging. There's instructions on the package.
So we have to open the package. You have to look at the package, read that, open it.
Correct.
It's not on the device itself.
No.
It's in the individual packaging.
It's inside.
It's, each one's packaged individually with instructions in the individual package.
Right,
It's
but
handed out
when-
to each officer.
When you take it out of the package, you no longer have the instructions.
The
So,
instructions itself is a large sheet that covers the package, the spit hood itself.
right. So the answer to my question is yes. Once you take it out, it no longer has the instructions.
Correct.
Do you have any evidence that any of the charged defendants ever used a spit hood before?
We have not had well, obviously we couldn't question the charge of things, so we don't know. But what we do know is that the spit hood at issue here is a Department issue spit hood that does contain those instructions.
Right. But it wasn't placed on there by these defendants.
No.
There's
But
no
They saw it in their presence.
I get that. My understanding is no officers in Tacoma Police Department ever received training with respect to it. Am I wrong about that?
I don't believe the department provided training on how to apply the spit hood.
So I mean,
but
if they had had the training, at least maybe there'd be some reason to think they knew about the warnings because it would have been in the training, right?
the warnings itself is on a large sheet of paper
But
that
you-
came within the package.
But you don't know that these defendants ever even saw that.
But we do know that it is the Department issue spit hood.
I gotcha. I understand that.
Circumstantially, I think we could, circumstantially, we could acknowledge because
If they had placed it on them, I would think I would have a better reason to do that. But you're trying to imply to them knowledge of a document containing packaging that they may or may not have ever seen. Right? On a spit hood that they didn't use.
but I think the point is that these three defendants are aware that Mr. Ellis had said he can't read.
Yes, you got that into evidence?
And we know that they were present when the spit was applied over his head.
Yes.
And we know that these instructions indicate that they shouldn't put the spit over someone who's having trouble breathing or vomiting or having.
Now, do you see any flaw in that last point you've made? No. Well, that's your problem. I see a flaw there. You're saying they know he said he couldn't breathe. They know a spit hood was applied. There's a warning label on the spit hood, but they didn't apply the spit hood, and there's no proof they ever saw the warning. That's your problem. You don't make point 3. So, I think that's a problem. I mean, obviously, there's going to be discussion of the spit hood because it's going to come up, I'm sure, when Dr. Clark testifies, among other things. It's already been discussed with Dr. Mitchell. Well, I believe it was Mr. Peterson who was questioning Dr. Mitchell when this issue came up with him. Have you waived the issue, Mr. Peterson, by asking him, doesn't the spit hood manufacturing label only disallow it if the bleeding is profuse? Why not?
Well, one is that Mr. Hobbs, we're going to get cases.
Well, yeah, but you're the one that raised this issue.
Well, just that whether or not he believed abuse and the doctor said he was not.
I think it was raised on direct first. I thought I objected to it.
Well, it was raised,
I think it was raised on direct first.
it was raised in direct in a different sort of way, I believe. Let me go back to my note, if I can find it. Dr. Mitchell mentioned that he'd examined the spit hood, and if my memory serves, he talked about blood being observed on the spit hood. That was noted in the autopsy report. And his biggest issue about the hood was that it would increase the risk of aspirating blood. Not that it was the cause of him aspirating blood, because he could have aspirated blood even if the spit hood didn't exist. But the aspiration of the blood the risk of that would have been increased by the spit hood. I believe that was basically his testimony. Anybody have, and so he described the spit hood as a contributing cause. As a marker of aspiration, and another reason why Mr. Ellis would have been hypoxic.
He described the aspiration as a contributing cause.
I think that's what I just said. So, yes, there's that, but that doesn't say anything about the label or the warnings or anything else. And as I say, the defense may talk about the spit hood being a contributing cause as something they didn't do. So I don't know if that's where they're going, but it wouldn't surprise me.
I do have one additional note, Your Honor. I believe Mr. Fredericks did say in his statement that he has used spit sauce before.
He has used a spit sock before?
Yes, he has used a spit hood.
Do we know if he used this one?
I'm sorry?
Do you know if he used this one?
I don't.
Okay.
But ultimately, we're talking about, in this case, it does involve a reckless standard for manslaughter. And circumstantial evidence of the officers allowing an item to be used on Mr. Ellis without knowledge of the risk is important, and it is relevant in this case.
Why wouldn't that be the responsibility of every single officer that was present?
Reckless to allow a spit or an item to put on someone who has already indicated he can't breathe numerous times. Bleeding from his mouth, and we have an officer that indicated that he was bleeding enough to form cool blood beneath him. And this is reckless, and this is circumstantial evidence. The label on the spit hood is, provides a warning that you shouldn't use it on someone in that condition, and it's relevant in this case.
Well, the warning has to do with vomiting or bleeding, right?
And not breathing, and breathing, difficulty breathing.
Okay.
It says you shouldn't use it on someone who's having difficulty breathing.
The bleeding part is bleeding profusely.
Right. And do we have anybody here from the can call anybody from the manufacturer about this?
Correct.
Or what's the manufacturer person going to say?
He will indicate that this is, the spit hood used in this case was something that they manufactured, that they provided back in March of 2020, and that the instructions that came with the packaging were the same back in March of 2020.
Well, sure, but is somebody from the manufacturer going to say anything about why it was posed a risk for somebody's health by using it in those circumstances?
No. We call simply to indicate that this is the spit hood that they manufactured back in March of 2020.
Was there any kind of testing? Is there any kind of testing done with respect to this thing as to why it would be dangerous?
We're not asking him to testify to that.
Okay. Mr. Oster, you're standing.
Judge, I just supplement what's aware of my concern. My client was never issued. They keep saying it was issued to my client. One had been issued to my client. My client's never been issued a spit hood. They have no information that it has. It's only available through the department. They made a request for every report that my client was involved in an arrest. They know he's never applied a spit hood. They have every report. So my client's never used it, was not provided it, and there's no information that he even know who put it on that night.
We're in the same boat. My client had just graduated from his probationary patrol. He'd never been trained on it. He'd never even used a spit hood prior to that. They've looked at all the reports for him as well. He was never issued a spit hood. He never asked for it. He never placed it on him. He would have Mr. Liu keeps talking about circumstantial evidence. We'll put it up. Don't put the cart before the horse like they keep doing. If you think that there's circumstantial evidence, then they should put that up into evidence and make it relevant. They can't because it's not
Well,
there.
they think the circumstantial evidence is the fact that they had access to a spit hood, and the instructions are right on that, and you can read that. And maybe they did and maybe they didn't, but there's circumstantial evidence that they had the information. That's his circumstantial evidence, right? Am I missing something, Mr. Lowe?
So that there's information out there that if my client had gone and searched for that information and obtained it, then he should have known this.
Well, there's the issue, there may be the issue of them showing that your particular client had it, or even Mr. Oster's, I suppose, which is one of the questions I asked, is there any reason to know that these officers ever used a spit hood before?
They didn't, Judge. They didn't. He'd never seen that warning. He'd never applied a spit hood. I mean, it's just, there's no knowledge base to implicate that my client should have known. I mean, if you had looked actually at the studies at the time that had been done, it would say that there is no inability, there's no study that would show that it inhibits the ability to breathe, actually, at that time. And the studies that have been done on these spit hoods talk about the permeability of them. So, I mean, that information is out there also. I mean, my client wasn't going out there looking at studies on the permeability of spit hoods.
No, but I was wondering about the warning, because I'm certainly aware, as a lawyer, as a judge, that companies are worried about getting sued if somehow somebody gets injured. So they put warnings on things to try to disclaim, in some sense, liability, or to claim
Sure.
misuse of the product as a defense in a product's liability claim that may happen. So why I asked about the business about the bleeding and the vomiting and so on, because it relates back, at least in my mind, to what Dr. Mitchell talked to us about the concern he had was not that Mr. Ellis couldn't breathe through it. His concern was he would aspirate things into his lungs, like vomit, like blood, which would cause him to have an inability to effectively take in oxygen. But the warning labels don't tell us much about that, at least in terms of these officers. So I tend to agree with the defense about this. Unless you got some evidence that they knew specifically about the warning label and disregarded it. Okay. Are we ready to resume with Mr. Frederick? Is everybody ready for the jury?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's have the jury. Welcome back, everyone. Please be seated. Okay, the objection from yesterday was sustained. Continue your redirect examination whenever you're ready, Ms. Nicolavo.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just, the objection was sustained, but the prior answer of inconsistent remains. Is that correct?
Move on to your next question.
Thank you. Mr. Fredericks, I just want to cover a few areas with you. You indicated yesterday that you had, well, you were asked several questions by Mr. Rosser about the timing of the lights, the traffic lights. And you were never able to authenticate any of the information you received from the city.
Correct.
And you don't know where the stop.
That last question and answer stands. That objection came too late. Next question.
What, if anything, do you know about where the stop bar, if that's the trigger?
I don't know what the trigger location is or the mechanism for the trigger.
And you also testified when Mr. Rosser asked you some questions about the downward motion from his client, Defendant Collins' arm coming downward to the same location on the XY coordinate as Mr. Ellis's head. Do you recall that line of questioning?
I do.
And what was the timing between those strikes?
Approximately a half a second was kind of the average timing between the four strikes that were visible.
You also testified yesterday on cross about, you said that Defendant Burbank was not moving in unison with Mr. Ellis when Mr. Ellis was on his back and Defendant Burbank moved out of the frame. What did you mean by not moving in unison?
I believe on the first or second day that I testified, I discussed what I meant.
I guess I didn't object, since we're referring to yesterday. So it's beyond the scope of cross.
Overruled. You may answer.
I described what I meant by moving in unison to give an indication whether there was a contact between one person and another person. And I described and demonstrated with the tracking arrows how Mr. Collins' knee was on Mr. Ellis's head, and they both moved together. That was in unison, meaning they were in contact. So yesterday when I was asked the question, and I described they were not moving in unison, which means they moved independently, so there was no evidence of contact.
You're also asked a series of questions by Mr. Rosser regarding Mr. Ellis getting a 230-pound guy off of him.
Yes, I recall that.
You recall that? And when, if at all, in the McDowell video, do you see any movement from Mr. Ellis getting a 230-pound guy off of him?
There were no images in the video, from the McDowell video, that showed Mr. Ellis moving Officer Collins off of him.
And what about in the Cowden video?
And about 10 seconds later, when the Cowden video starts up, there are no images that show Mr. Ellis moving, lifting in any way Officer Collins off of him.
He also testified with Mr. Rosser. He asked you a series of questions about if you could hear Mr. Ellis struggling with the officers. You recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
And at one point you corrected him in that you said, you corrected your answer in that you can hear them having contact with Mr. Ellis. Why did you correct your answer?
I listened carefully to the questions being asked, and then I realized that I might not be as precise in my responses to the positive, where he asked me about Mr. Ellis struggling. And I don't have, I'm not a use of force expert. It goes beyond my area of expertise. So I changed my response to in contact, because that's what I really intended. I don't intend to have an opinion about who was struggling. And I think that in some respects, the video speaks for itself in that regard.
You also were asked several questions about the different sources that you used. I believe the Vivint video, what you chose to put into the sync timeline, what you chose not to. Do you also receive additional audio sources for this that you could have put in the sync timeline?
Yes.
And why did you choose to not include those audio sources?
They, as I said yesterday, those sources were not initiated at the scene, and they weren't broadcast on that I call it a district or an area's channel. So they were intended for other jurisdictions. They wouldn't have been audible at the scene, so they didn't go into the scene timeline.
Nothing further, thank you.
Okay,
I
request.
just have one question, Your Honor, if
Go
I
ahead.
may. Mr. Fredericks, as far as related to your statement here just a moment ago regarding Mr. Burbank, and you said him moving backwards was not in unison with the leg of Mr. Ellis. If I recall correctly yesterday, you were not saying there wasn't contact, is that correct?
I think there's no evidence of contact on the video.
But it was pretty, but you weren't suggesting that the evidence suggested that there was, either was or was not contact?
No. As I stated, there's no evidence of contact.
From what you could see through the McDowell video?
From what the video shows. There was no evidence on the video that showed contact, and specifically
Specifically the McDowell video as opposed to the other video?
Yes, and specifically at the time that I was being asked about with the movement of the leg and the movement of Burbank moving backwards out of view of the camera.
That's all I have.
Mr. Osler? Sure.
Morning, sir. Good.
Ms. Nikolava just asked you about whether there was any images on the McDowell video showing Mr. Ellis getting up or moving from the position with Officer Collins, a 230-pound person on top of him, and you said no, correct?
Well, no. The question was specifically moving a 230-pound person, not just movement, but moving that person off.
Understood.
Yeah.
The video shows Exhibit 20 that we spent yesterday, 174 still images of that 6 seconds, ends with Officer Collins on top of Mr. Ellis, right?
Correct.
Delivering the 4 strikes that we've discussed, right?
Yes, sir.
The next visual evidence that we see in the chronology is Mr. Ellis through the Cowden video with Officer Collins now on his back as opposed to on his front, correct?
So, just to be clear, it shows Officer Collins behind Mr. Ellis,
Fair enough.
and Mr. Ellis is not on his back.
Understood.
Yes.
Officer Collins is behind Mr. Ellis at that point, right?
Correct.
And I think yesterday you said that the time difference from the last image of Officer Collins on top to the first image of Mr. Cowden is approximately 10 seconds.
Roughly 10 seconds.
All right. So in 10 seconds, you would agree that Mr. Ellis moved from his back with a 230-pound officer on him to a position where that officer is now behind him.
No. So you've said that Mr. Ellis moved. I don't know if Mr. Ellis was moved or he moved by himself. I cannot comment
So
on that.
you're suggesting that maybe Officer Collins moved him to that position?
I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying that I am not going to agree that it was Mr. Ellis who moved on his own fruition, by his own power, because there's no video to tell us whether or not that occurred.
All right, but you'll agree that he was in a different position and Officer Collins was in a different position 10 seconds later?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. That's all I got, Judge.
Morning, Mr. Fredericks.
Morning, sir.
Can we pull up 33A real quick? Please. Thank you. And this is the video timeline that you created, is that right, Mr. Fredericks?
That I assisted with, yes.
Okay. And so this first page, it shows obviously the timeline from the start of your Vivint video here, 23, 21, 41.
Yes.
And then obviously you're showing where the start of McDowell's first video is, the start of Cowden's first video. So this first page of 33A, you'd agree with me, my client is never present during any time period on the first page of 33A, is that right?
That's right.
Okay, and can you go to the second page of 33A, please? Okay, and then you have the start of the next Vivint video here, right, at 23, 23, 14, and they run for 29 seconds, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and then the next Vivint video obviously starts again, and it's at 23, 24, 35, so right about here where my client first arrives on scene, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and then you obviously have the video runs until 23, 25, 03, and then it ends.
Yes.
Okay, and then all this space right here, all the way to White's video, formerly known as White, now Moulane, that's the next video that we have in time, is that right?
Yes, and there's no, yes, that's correct.
Okay. All this space is black because for whatever reason the door cam didn't capture anything and no one else was taking any cell phone video during that time frame.
That's correct.
The only thing we have are dispatch communications at that point.
Yes.
Okay. And then you have this White video starts here, that lasts about 15 seconds, is that right?
Yes.
And then you have, again, black space because no video is capturing anything, and then the next time we have Vivint video is 23, 41, 17.
Yes.
Okay. And we talked yesterday about White's video's placement and that you used the metadata that was associated with that, as well as the fact that you knew fire wasn't there quite yet, which we see in these later videos, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that you placed it somewhere in between here, obviously, and based on the metadata, in between this black space, saying, okay, well, the metadata shows that it's occurred here, so I'm going to place it here, and that makes sense given where fire arrives. Is that fair?
And to the other, the change of the scene, yes.
Okay, and then you have a couple of Vivint videos here showing fire's arrival, and the other officers are there on scene, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then the next video that you have from Miss White is that last video where there are resuscitation efforts done on Mr. Ellis, right?
Well, I don't have any comment about what's occurring on the video, except that they're all in the area where Mr. Ellis is.
Okay, fair enough. So, but that's the last kind of video that you have in time along with these Vivants, is that right?
That's right.
Okay, I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
For the director.
Nothing else from the state, Your Honor, we just reserve the right to recall.
Ms. Frederick. I'm sorry, Ms. Fricky.
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Ms. Strasser.
Nothing, thank you, Judge.
Okay, Ms. Frederick, thank you very much. You're excused.
If I can just have a moment to get our next witness.
Sure.
Your Honor, the State Falls Police County Sheriff's Department, Detective Brian Hughes.
Yes, sir. Please come forward right about there and raise your right hand to be sworn. Solemnly swear or affirm that your testimony in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you very much, sir. Have a seat right there. Please state your name and please spell your name.
Brian Peterson, Brian Petersen.
Proceed.
Detective Peterson, can you please tell the jury what your jury occupation is?
Yes, I'm a detective at the Pierce County Sheriff's Department.
And how long have you been with Pierce County Sheriff's Department?
With Pierce County since August of 2012.
Do you have prior law enforcement experience before Pierce County?
Yes, I started at the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office as a deputy in 2005. I moved to the Port of Seattle Police Department for a short time in 2011, and then I came here to Pierce County.
Can you also take them through your background with Pierce County as far as the positions that you've held?
Sure. I started as a patrol deputy, as everybody who works for the Sheriff's Department does. After 2.5 years or so of working the street, I moved to our domestic violence unit as an investigator. I spent a year there, and then I moved to what we call our juvenile crimes unit, which is mostly investigating juvenile sex crimes. Then I was promoted to detective, and I moved to our robbery and aggravated assault unit. I did that for a few years. I also did some more sex crimes and some frauds, and I moved to our domestic violence unit again in July of 2020, and I've been there since then.
Yeah, and even though you've been assigned to different units, is it common to assist other divisions and units within the department if necessary?
Yes. Yeah, we all sort of work together. I'm also on our one of our homicide teams, so that's another thing that I get drawn into.
Can you tell the jury a little bit about the homicide team and how you can get drawn into that?
The way that the Sheriff's Department does these sorts of cases is we have two different teams, and I can't remember exactly how many detectives is on each team, but it's 12 or so, 10, I don't know. And so for every murder that happens, the other team goes out and kind of saturates the scene and kind of front loads the investigation with a lot of effort right at the beginning. And then after that, we have specific detectives that do the rest of the follow-up work. And that's not me. My primary assignment is domestic violence, but I'm one of the detectives that goes out for the initial kind of saturation, as I called it.
And were you part of the homicide team in 2020?
Yes.
And did you have an opportunity to become involved in the investigation on the in-custody death and homicide of Mr. Manuel Ellis?
I did. It was after the fact.
And how did you become involved in that?
On March 18th of 2020, a detective sergeant, Byron Brockway, called me on the phone and asked me if I would meet up with a couple of the Tacoma officers that were involved in this incident to take photos of a hobble.
Did you know the Tacoma officers personally?
No.
Through the contact with Detective Sergeant Brockway, were you able to determine the names of the officers to contact?
Yes. I believe the only officer that was mentioned was Officer Matt Collins.
And on March 18th of 2020, did you follow up as requested by Detective Sergeant Brockway to photograph the hobble that was used in this incident?
Yes.
And can you take us through the steps that you took to do so?
So Detective Sergeant Brockway called me, asked me if I could do this. He then sent me an email that had Officer Collins' phone number on it, and so sometime during that day I called Officer Collins and arranged to meet with him and another officer. I can't remember who the other officer was. And I met with them in the evening. I don't know if you want me to continue with.
Where did you meet with Matt?
At the Tacoma Police Department headquarters.
And when you met with them at the Tacoma Police Department headquarters, did you go into the security area for where the patrol vehicle was located?
Yes.
What did you do when you went to security area?
Officer Collins opened up his car for me, and I took photos of where the hobble was at. It was in a glove box, and so I took a photo of that, and then removed the hobble and put it on the ground, and I took a photo of it on the ground.
Commissioner Approach. Handy what's been marked as states exhibits 220, 221, and 222. Can you review those, please? Are those the photographs that you just testified about?
Yes.
And they accurately depict what you observed that night?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state offers in evidence 220, 221, and 222.
Okay, 220, 221, and 222 are admitted.
Your Honor, permission to publish, starting with 221, please.
Proceed.
And Detective Peterson, can you tell the jury 221 what that depicts?
Yes, this is a photo of Tacoma police car, I believe Officer Collins' car, you know, into the, where the glove box is at.
Okay. And it's listed as patrol car 2773.
Yes.
You said that you believe it's Officer Collins' car. Is that the car that you were directed to by Officer Collins when you met with him?
Yes.
If we could publish 220, 222, please. Could you describe to the jury what this depicts?
This is the glove box, and you can see that kind of strap-looking item in the glove box.
Could you please step down and
Sure.
to the jury? And when you opened, do you recall who opened the glove box?
I don't recall.
Did you know where the strap would have been, the bottle strap would have been kept?
Only because they told me.
Would you also take a picture of the actual hobble and exhibit 220?
Yes.
Permission to publish.
Proceed.
Did you take any measurements of that hobble?
No.
Did you make any observations about it, as far as the brand or the length?
Nope. Just photographed it.
And do you take it into evidence at all?
No.
Why not?
As I said, my involvement with this whole thing was very minimal. Detective Sergeant Brockway asked me to photograph the hobble, and that's what I did.
Did you have any other involvement in the case?
No.
Did you write a report at all regarding the hobble or the work that you did?
Nope.
No further questions.
Judge, thank you. Detective, good morning. I don't have any questions.
Good morning. Thank you.
Detective, good morning. Just a couple questions. You said you work for the Peterson County Sheriff,
Correct.
and you've been there since 13 or so?
2012.
2012, okay, gotcha. And you were asked if you know any defendants. You said no, is that right?
Correct.
Okay, just want to make sure. And you said that you were told that Officer Collins might have the hobbles, is that right?
So when I spoke with Detective Sergeant Byron Brockway, he provided Officer Collins' phone number. So I can only presume that it was because he thought he had the hobble.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And then where did you guys meet for you to pick up the hobble?
At the Tacoma Police Headquarters.
Okay, and was Officer Collins on duty?
Yes.
Okay. Was he cooperative?
Yes.
Good morning.
Okay, if I stand over here, it's hard for me to get around.
Sure, sure.
Good morning, I represent Officer Tim Rankin. Do you know Officer Rankin? I think you don't.
No. Of course, you know, in law enforcement, it's possible to run into people out on the street and you don't remember running into them. But I don't know any of the officers.
And he's seated here to my left, and you don't recognize him, is that right?
Correct.
Do you know if he was ever trained with the use of for the use of hobbles?
I do not know.
And were you aware that he didn't carry hobbles at the time of the incident?
Sustained.
Were you aware of him ever requesting hobbles or assisting in placing hobbles in this case?
No.
He's already testified he doesn't know.
Let's cross.
It seems to me he's established that he has a lack of personal information with respect to this.
All right. Fair enough. Thank you, Your Honor. And I think you've indicated before, at least in an interview, Detective, that you can't say for sure whether what's depicted in the picture of the hobble would indicate or represent the hobbles used in this case.
That is true.
And have you seen hobbles before?
Yes.
And have you used them yourself?
Yes.
Under what circumstances?
Sustained. If you want to call him in your own case, that's up to you.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
If you want to call him in your own case, it's up to you. He hasn't provided any information with respect to the use of hobbles,
Understood, Your Honor.
merely to the photography of hobbles.
Okay. Thank you, Detective. That's all I have.
You're welcome.
Follow up, Your Honor.
Sure.
Detective Peterson, it was Officer Collins that provided you the hobbles from his own vehicle.
Yes, there was another officer there. I believe they were a double car. I don't remember who that other officer was. So,
Sorry. Based on your instruction by Detective Sergeant Brockway, and was he actually the one that was overseeing the investigation?
that was my understanding.
And based on your instruction that you received from him, would the photograph of the hobbles that you took be the hobbles that were actually used in the incident?
That would be my understanding.
And then you left them in the control of Officer Collins?
Correct.
Okay.
Nothing further on, thank you.
Nothing further. Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you, Detective. You're excused.
Thank you.
Can I have a moment, Ron, to get our next witness?
Sure.
State calls Lieutenant Wilson.
Yes, sir. Please come forward to right about here. Raise your right hand to be sworn. I solemnly swear or affirm that your testimony in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
Thank you very much, sir. Have a seat right here. Please state your name and please spell your name.
My name is Nicholas Wilson, Nicholas Wilson.
Thank you. Ms. Eakes.
Lieutenant Wilson, can you please tell the jury who you're employed by?
The City of Tacoma, Tacoma Fire Department,
And how long have you been working for the fire department?
since 2011.
And can you tell us what your current rank and role is?
Currently, I'm a lieutenant paramedic with the fire department.
How long have you been a lieutenant?
Several years now.
And you said you started in 2011, is that right?
Correct.
And you said you're a paramedic?
That's correct.
Can you please tell the jury what your education and training is that qualifies you to be a paramedic?
It's a very extensive training program. I also hold several degrees in addition to that. There's ongoing continuing education. It's pretty extensive.
And maybe you can just tell us, what does a paramedic do?
It's a very broad scope. Essentially, we can do many things doctors can do in the ER, intubations, IVs, invasive treatments. There's a plethora of different drugs that we can administer when appropriate, and different treatments.
And how does that compare to, let's say, an EMT or a firefighter?
An EMT is the very basic level. They can CPR, utilize a BVM to help somebody breathe, administer a small number of medications.
And were you a firefighter before you were a paramedic?
Correct. I have over 20 years of experience. Pre-hospital care, emergency rooms.
And you said that the program's pretty extensive. Do you know about how long it is?
I couldn't tell you. That some programs are more intense and compressed, others are longer.
What about the one you went through?
It was 6 months of intense classroom with no breaks, and then you have your preceptorship, and Tacoma Fire Department subsequents that, or augments that once you're a paramedic with further probationary time.
And you said what year did you become a paramedic?
2009.
Right. I want to ask you questions about a call. Did you respond to a call on March 3rd, 2020 at the intersection of 96th and Ainsworth?
We did.
And what station were you working at that time?
Tacoma Fire Station 10. It's in the south end of Tacoma.
Okay. Can you tell us where Station 10 is located approximately?
Approximately 74th and South Park Avenue.
And were you working with anyone else on that night?
2 other individuals. It's a 3-person engine company.
And who were those other individuals that you were working with?
The officer that night was Lieutenant Ridgway. The third was firefighter Polo and myself.
And were you working as a paramedic at that time?
Correct.
And you said, were you a lieutenant at that time? You said it was
I was not.
Okay. So you got promoted after March of 2020?
Correct.
Okay. And at that time, I'm going to just jump ahead for a second. As part of being responding to a call as a paramedic, did you prepare any sort of document or report that would cover the work that you did there?
I believe you're referring to our pre-hospital patient care report.
Did you prepare that in this case?
I did.
I'm going to have you take a look at what's been marked as Exhibit 24. Finally approach, Your Honor.
Yes.
Handing you what's been marked as Exhibit 24.
Thank you.
Tell the jury, take a look at it and tell us if you recognize that document.
I do recognize this document as my pre-hospital care report.
And when did you prepare that report?
This was prepared. It was prepared that night.
And the night of March 3rd?
Correct.
Or the morning of March 4th?
More or less.
Okay. Does it actually show what time you prepared the report?
I do not believe so.
And did you sign that report?
I have signed this report.
And what's your purpose of preparing it?
The purpose of preparing this report is to memorialize that event and our involvement in treatments that were rendered, the care that we provided, the efforts made, and it's a legal document.
Okay, is it considered a medical record also?
It is,
from your
and it's
purposes?
protected by HIPAA and every other.
Okay. And would you agree that that document would be the best recording of accounting of what happened that night when you responded to that call?
This document is the narrative portion is my recollection of the events. The LifePack data is merged with this at some level. There is data behind the scenes that I do not have access to in preparing this. I mean, we're looking at a 40-plus minute cardiac arrest, and there's only a few snippets of the actual EKGs and event. So having access to that would give you the absolute full picture of this.
And is that considered the information from the LifePack? Is that right?
Correct. I believe it's, yes.
LifePack 15?
Yes.
Okay. But in terms of what is on there, it contains some information from the LifePack, is that right?
That is correct.
And with this document, is it something you keep in the regular course of business?
Every patient contact one is generated.
Offer Exhibit 24.
I don't have any objection. No objection, no objection.
24 is admitted.
All right. And tell me, would it be helpful for you to be able to refer to that report as I ask you questions about this incident?
Absolutely.
Okay, I know it's been 3.5 years. Any idea how many calls you've been out on since that time?
Thousands.
Can you tell the jury, first of all, do you have a specific memory of this call?
I have bits and pieces. I have this report in my depositions prior that I've reviewed, so I have a somewhat fragmented recollection of this. We're not required to maintain a recollection of every single patient contact. That's why we produce these, so we can reference them.
Okay. And you referred to your deposition. Are you talking about interviews that you gave in this case?
Correct. We were interviewed by the state first, then the Attorney General's office, and then we had a chance to meet with the defense.
Okay. And I take it sounds like you've looked at those documents.
I have.
To refresh your memory as well.
Those that were made available to myself, I have, yes.
Okay. Were there any that weren't made available to you?
I've only reviewed the state and the State Patrol.
Those two interviews?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Can you just tell the jury, what do you recall about when you arrived at this? Well, first of all, let me back up. Prior to going to this call, what, if any, information did you have about the nature of the call?
We're given a dispatch. It's an automated system. And essentially, the summation of that information was that we were dispatched to evaluate an individual in custody.
And other than, so that comes from your dispatch, is that right?
Correct. We have a dispatch center, and they dispatch the appropriate units for whatever information they have.
Okay. And does your report indicate that that's the information you had was just to evaluate a person in custody?
Correct.
And is that contained on your report there that you're looking at?
It is.
All right. And so tell us, what time did you receive? Maybe just walk us through what happens when you get a call from dispatch.
We immediately respond. We go to the rig, we safely enter the rig, and then we proceed to wherever that address or general location is of the call.
And what kind of a rig were you driving that night?
It was a fire engine.
And were you driving it?
I was.
And what time were you dispatched on this call?
According to my report, we were dispatched at 23:26:49. We went en route at 23:28:30, and on 23:33:09.
23:33:09, you said you arrived at the scene?
Correct.
And how was that information reported, Lieutenant?
So the dispatch is memorialized in our CAD data as soon as that unit is dispatched. The en route time is stamped by the officer physically pushing a button in the rig that indicates that we are now en route. And the on scene is also generated by a physical button push on a touch screen.
Okay. And so then what happens when you arrive at the scene?
That's, I believe I just stated that.
After
A button
you
push.
the buttons, what do you
Okay.
do?
So depending on the nature of the call, we exit the vehicle, we acquire whatever gear or medical aid equipment that we're going to need for whatever the call is, and then we proceed to where we think that equipment is going to be most useful, the side of the patient, in this case.
Can you just describe for us what you recall seeing when you arrived at the scene at 96th and Ainsworth?
There were multiple police officer vehicles on scene, patrol cars. So we had to park a distance back, roughly a block to a half a block away.
Okay. And do you remember which direction or which street you parked on?
I believe we were facing west on 96th.
Okay, so you were coming up 96, going headed west, is that right?
Correct. We traveled south on Yakima, took a right on 96th, then parked.
Okay. And then once you had your equipment, what did you do?
We began approaching the patient.
All right. Do you know what time you actually arrived and had first contact with Mr. Ellis?
So according to my report, we're at patient side at 23:34. Roughly a minute and a half later. And again, that button is, when that button gets pushed on the iPad, we can mark that and timestamp it. Typically, it's fairly accurate. Sometimes it's delayed.
All right. And you said, I'm sorry, at what time, 23:34?
41,
41? Okay, you said that was about a minute and a half?
by my math.
All right. And is that, yeah, I have to go home. I don't want to hold you too closely to that. Is that a pretty typical amount of time that it takes to get your gear and get over
I
the
would,
patient?
yes, that is a very quick time to carry that amount of equipment that far.
And can you just tell us generally, do you remember when you arrived at the scene, could you see Mr. Ellis or what his position was?
Correct. In my report, I state Mr. Ellis was on his back. He's supine. In depositions, I've stated that he was on his back and slightly to his left side, being held there in that position from behind. I think that's referred to as the recovery position. But supine, on his back, I'm clearly able to see his chest, his face.
And you said, and let me just ask you more generally, in terms of the scene, where was he relative to the road?
He was in the roadway.
And you said that there were other officers at the scene. Do you have any specific memory of how many officers or whether any officers were touching Mr. Ellis at the time that you arrived?
There's at least one officer holding Ellis from behind, but I don't know how many officers were on scene and their exact locations. We have a police presence on scene, which makes me feel safe. They don't call us in until the scene is safe and secure because we're unable to render care if we're incapacitated. So it's standard practice for them to secure the scene, call for us, we approach, we render care.
And was anybody suggesting that the scene wasn't safe when you arrived there?
Prior to us arriving, it was made aware to us that this patient was aggressive and not following commands, resisting arrest, and they had to restrain him in order to subdue him.
Okay. And you say that prior to arriving on scene, how did you receive that information?
That information is given to us as we're approaching the patient in an expedited manner.
Just so we're clear, like after you're parked there.
Correct. So sometime from our arrival on scene and our arrival at the patient's side.
And do you know who it was that shared that information with you?
I do not have a recollection of who specifically gave that. It's multiple officers that were on scene that told us this information.
As you're walking up to Mr.
Correct.
Ellis. All right. And was Mr. Ellis restrained when you first saw him?
He was in handcuffs and I believe hobbled, though my focus more is on his respiratory drive and deciding whether or not he's actually in cardiac arrest at this moment because he had minimal respiratory drive.
Okay. And tell us what you mean by that. He had minimal respiratory drive.
His body was not breathing adequately on its own to sustain life.
And is that an assessment you made as you just first walked up to him?
I'm still walking up to him and making that assessment.
And tell us how you're able to do that, Lieutenant.
Just like I can sit here today and look at you and watch your chest rise as you breathe, and everybody sitting in the jury and everybody in the courtroom, you can make an assessment of somebody's ability to maintain their own airway, to breathe, and their level of consciousness.
So even before you arrived at his side, you could tell that Mr. Ellis didn't have adequate respiratory drive, is that what you said?
Correct.
And do you recall how Mr. Ellis was clothed?
He had some bulky clothing on.
And again, it sounds like, in terms of asking about the restraints, it sounds like that wasn't what your focus was in terms of how exactly he was restrained. Is that fair?
Correct. He was restrained in an appropriate manner and typical for somebody who has been in an altercation with PD and is in custody.
Okay. And you said that he had a hobble on. Do you remember any specifics about that?
I do not even recall looking towards his lower appendages.
Okay. What were you focused on?
I was focused on his chest and his mouth, his airway.
All right, so tell us just walk us through what happened. As you walk up, you can tell that he's not had adequate respiratory drive.
Correct. He's obtunded. We need to breathe for him. So we start with a BVM. We have the restraints removed. We ask officers to remove the restraints. My lieutenant also asked to have them removed. They expressed some concern for safety. We assured them that that was no longer an issue, and we began to render care. So from the start, we're breathing for him. He tolerates this well in that he's not fighting the BVM. If somebody's breathing spontaneously, sometimes you have a difficult time ventilating them mechanically. We did not encounter that in this case.
And you said, what is the BVM?
It's a bag valve mask. I don't know if you've ever seen a show that had any sort of medical things depicted, but it's essentially a bag with a mask that you form a seal over the face and mechanically squeeze the air into the patient, which is oxygenated.
How soon after you arrived on the scene did you start using the BVM on Mr. Ellis?
As soon as the spit hood is removed, so we cut that away and began ventilating him.
So tell us about that. You said there was a spit hood on Mr. Ellis. Where was it placed?
Correct. It was placed over his lower face, so below his nose and above his chin.
And you believe you cut that away, or was it just removed?
Correct. That's the fastest way to remove things. We also cut his clothing off, so we have access to his chest. We can place leads and our paddles, more or less, are stickers. They're pads that are placed, so now we can monitor his electrical rhythm.
Now, you said that you asked that the restraints be removed and that the officers expressed, or somebody expressed concern for safety.
Correct.
And I think you said Lieutenant Ridgway also asked that the,
Correct.
is that right?
Mhm.
And can you tell me, do you recall who it was who expressed concern about?
I do not recall.
restraint? Was it one officer, more than one officers, do you recall?
I don't recall.
And when in sequence was it when you asked that they be removed versus when Lieutenant Ridgway asked that they be removed?
Seconds. This was a 5-second interaction.
And in terms of the Bagmel,
The BVM.
Sorry, yeah.
The abbreviated term is much easier to say.
It's much easier, thank you. When did you do that in relation to whether or not the restraints were removed?
It's my recollection that it was done consecutively. So the spit hood's removed. As soon as that's removed, we're taking his airway and breathing for him.
And you said a moment ago that sometimes people who are able to breathe don't tolerate it well. What if any response was there from Mr. Ellis?
So from my vantage point, having not been the person using the BVM, I don't see any resistance, nor is any brought to my attention.
Now, you've told us that Mr. Ellis's breathing, you could tell immediately, wasn't sustainable with life.
Correct. It was shallow, irregular.
And do you recall at any point, did you refer to it as agonal breathing?
Correct. Agonal is a term we use for breathing that's not conducive with life. It's too shallow. Without intervention, there will be a subsequent probable cardiac arrest.
What about any other, or maybe you can just describe for us what Mr. Ellis's how responsive Mr. Ellis was at all?
So I gave him a GCS of 3, which is essentially the GCS of a rock, if more or less. So he has no purposeful movements, no purposeful eye movements, and he's not making any sort of sounds or speaking whatsoever.
And can you tell the jury what GCS is?
GCS stands for the Glasgow Coma Scale. It's a scale we use to assess an individual's level of consciousness.
And you said that you gave him a score that's consistent with a rock?
Correct. It's like the lowest score you can have is a 3. So he got a 3.
And how did you check for those items, his eye movement, his speech, and his movement in response to things?
Without even having to touch him, he's not moving. He's not responding to anybody on scene. Painful stimuli could be applied. He's not responding to that.
Okay. And so do you do all those things and see that you're not getting any sort of...
Correct. And I'm doing those things while I'm checking for a pulse, because as I'm approaching, I'm concerned that this person is in cardiac arrest. So I immediately check for a pulse. He has a pulse. I apply some painful stimuli. There's no response. He's not responding to any verbal communication, and he's not making any noises.
And so you said you checked for a pulse. Tell us what you observed about whether or not Mr. Ellis had a pulse.
So his pulse was weak and thready, irregular, I believe I stated in one of my depositions. Here, I echo the same. Yep.
And maybe we could we publish Exhibit 24 so the jury can see what you're looking at?
Yes.
Maybe we can just kind of zero in a little bit. Can you tell us what you're looking at in terms of...
So the first paragraph is the subjective information. It's essentially all of the information that we're told, where we receive, individuals tell us. The second paragraph is our findings, and it's a generalization of our primary assessment, and if things get missed in that, then they're They're found later, they're in that portion. The third line is my best guess and my belief of what is happening here. Cardiac arrest secondary to excited delirium. The patient has been taken into custody. He's believed to be under unknown substances or substance, and the subsequent cardiac arrest that ensued leads me to that conclusion. The final paragraph is our treatment modality in somewhat of a chronological order, and the single line that says no changes, that's referring to all of our treatments, our care, and throughout all of that, we received no positive response from the individual. And at the bottom line, that is where we note who we shared information with. So TFD individuals, TPD, and Madigan Army Medical Center was our base station at that time, Dr. Ernst.
So let's just kind of walk through it then. Thank you for helping us understand what.
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll take our morning recess, lay jump for 15 minutes. Please do not discuss case among yourselves or with anyone else. Please do not permit anyone to discuss the case with you in your presence, and we'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you, Lieutenant.
Thanks.
Need you back in 15 minutes, too.
All right.
I think before the break, you mentioned that Mr. Ellis, when you checked his pulse initially, was weak and thready.
Correct.
Can you just explain to the jury what that means?
If you were to take your own pulse right now, it would probably be strong and palpable. You'd be able to feel it with ease. The patient, upon my arrival and feeling for a pulse, that pulse is hard to find. I find it, I feel that it's weak and thready.
And what does thready mean?
Soft,
So not very strong.
not bounding, not normal, it's weak.
Okay. And what does that tell you when you have a pulse that's weak and thready?
Tells you that his heart is not beating fully like a normal, healthy heart.
All right, let's go back to Exhibit 24. So you explained to us, which is on the screen, and you explained to us kind of what each paragraph was about. So can you just take us through the first paragraph and explain, what information is information in that paragraph that you observed versus information you might have received from others?
Absolutely. So the first paragraph, again, is our subjective portion of our report. The rig responding is engine 10. That's the rig that the three of us arrived on that night and were dispatched solo with TPD to assist eval. There's a general overview of the patient, a 33-year-old male, and essentially a chief complaint. Unconscious, unresponsive, with minimal respiratory drive and deteriorating.
Let me stop you there for just a moment. Was Mr. Ellis, during your treatment of it, in contact with him, unconscious and unresponsive?
That's correct.
And what does that mean to you? What's the significance of that to you as a paramedic?
That he is not conscious. He is, in fact, unconscious, and he is not responding to us, so he's unresponsive.
Okay. We can go on to the next sentence.
We then upgrade ALS because we were dispatched solo. We're not a transport unit, we're a fire engine, and this patient obviously needs ALS, which is advanced life support. So we call for a medic unit and quickly add another unit because my general feeling is that this patient could potentially deteriorate into cardiac arrest fairly quickly. So we need more bodies on scene because we have a lot to do and not a lot of time to do it.
Okay. In terms of the amount of care that you need to give him?
Correct. I am one paramedic. I would like to have more friends that are paramedics on scene. So, yep. Tower 2 and Medic 1 are then subsequently dispatched. Tower 2 comes from Station 8, which is at 48th in South Alaska, and the only available medic unit at that time, that night, because all of the other medic units in the city are busy saving other lives, is Medic 1 coming from Jackson and 6th Ave. So fairly far way away, right? It's a great distance to travel. So I am essentially the ALS provider on scene solely until that medic unit gets on scene.
All right.
Further, I report patient is supine on ground in handcuffs with restrained extremities ×4 and multiple TPD officers assisting restraining. So there's multiple officers on scene. I don't exactly know what they're doing, but I feel safe. And one officer at least is helping restrain and keep the patient in the position that they're in. And I give a quick overview of what was told to me upon my arrival and approaching the patient and throughout. So patient charging vehicles was apparent threat. Patient was tased and restrained and then went limp. Prior to going limp was very strong and difficult to restrain, subdue. TPD officers believe patient is suffering from excited delirium and under the influence of unknown substances.
So we're clear on that section. Do you have any personal knowledge about what happened prior to your arrival?
I do not.
All right. So are you just reporting what somebody's telling you at the scene?
Correct.
And do you have any idea or any memory of who might have been telling you those things about what happened with Mr. Ellis?
I do not. I know that they were in TPD uniforms and acting with authority and speaking matter-of-factly.
Okay. And was it more than one person who provided you this information?
I believe this is a combination of multiple individuals giving me information.
All right. So you said the first paragraph is your subjective paragraph.
Correct.
Talk about what you recorded in your second paragraph then. What's this paragraph about?
This paragraph is essentially our objective information, the physical findings that we encounter as we are providing care. And I try to steer this section more towards what the initial findings are, sometimes it includes things that I don't get initially and I find later. So would you like me to read from it and explain as I go? Absolutely. So again, upon engine 10, it's the fire apparatus that we are staffing this day. Upon our arrival at the patient's side, restraints, bulky clothing, spit hood removed with rapid patient assessment. Patient is now apneic and with bradycardia, which despite aggressive BVM, that's the bag valve mask, and airway management, rapidly developed into cardiac arrest. So
Stop you there. Yeah, sorry, I was going to ask you what
that's
apnea
okay. Yeah.
meant, and then we'll talk about bradycardia.
Apneic means without respiratory drive. So essentially, you're not breathing at this point.
All right, and how do you determine that he's not breathing?
Visually,
Lack of chest up and down?
lack of chest rise, lack of air movement. Correct.
And then what's bradycardia?
Bradycardia is a slowing of the heart. And I remember his heart rate as being irregular and slow, and prior to putting him on the monitor. From there, I give an overview of his neuro status. So he's unconscious, unresponsive, with a Glasgow Coma scale of 111 and an ANO, alert and oriented times 0. I think everyone in the room today would get a score of 4 for that. You're alert to person, place, time, and event. With a GCS of 111, you're typically not alert and oriented to anything. He has no outward signs of major trauma. That's a quick head to toe. That's why we remove the bulk of the clothing. I see no indications that trauma is the cause of this event. Superficial scratches and abrasions throughout. HEENT stands for head, ears, eyes, nose, throat. So that's essentially his head, right? His pupils are fixed and dilated. His airway is intact with a moderate amount of secretions, which is more or less a normal amount that you would expect in somebody's airway. And no blood is noted in his airway.
And let me ask you about the pupils being fixed and dilated. What did that indicate to you as someone who's attempting to treat him, Mr. Ellis?
This individual is very sick, and fixed and dilated means they are not reactive to light. This is a difficult finding to assess at night because our eyes dilate at night, and it is also dark out, and depending on the color of your eye, it's difficult to see and assess. So this is my ability to look and see his eyes and what I believe them to be.
And would the fixed and dilated indicate anything to you about whether or not there was hypoxia?
I think given the presentation of the patient is my indicator that this patient is not breathing adequately. Perhaps their heart is not perfusing adequately, and that is more or less what tells me that this patient is hypoxic. I'm feeling for a pulse. His heart's not circulating the blood volume. He's not breathing, so there's no oxygen to exchange at this point. We're now breathing for him, but his heart is failing to capture that oxygen with the red blood cells flowing through his lungs. His neck and back, there's nothing remarkable. Chest, I note apnea, which is the lack of breathing. And the abdomen is soft and non-tender, which is essentially unremarkable. Extremities, CMS is circulation, motor, sensory. He's not able to move his extremities for us, and has no motor function, can't tell us if he's feeling anything, that sort of thing. And his skin is cool and clammy.
Now, and I think you said this, but I just want to be clear. During the time that you treated Mr. Ellis, did he speak at all?
Mr. Ellis was unconscious and unresponsive for the entirety of the event. As far as my interaction goes, he did not say anything.
Now, as a result of this kind of rapid assessment, what did you do to try to treat Mr. Ellis, Lieutenant?
So that is in the third large paragraph after excited delirium and cardiac arrest. Rapid patient assessment, we did the BVM with an OPA, which is an oral pharyngeal airway. It's inserted to keep the tongue up off of the lower airway so that we can effectively push oxygen and air into his lungs and not his esophagus and into his stomach. We managed his airway. We placed him on the monitor with pads and a EKG leads times 4, that's 4 extremities. So it's a 4 lead we've placed on him. We've also placed the pads on him.
And where do you put the monitor pads? I'm sorry, the times 4, the ECG.
So those are placed on the extremities. You have upper extremities times 2, and you have 2 lower extremities. If you don't have those extremities, they're put at the furthest corner where that extremity should be.
So you put it on his upper shoulder area and then on his lower legs?
Correct. The further out you can get, the more accurate it is, but I believe with this individual, they're placed on his left and right upper extremities. Yep.
All right, so we're talking about what treatment you give him. So you immediately start bag masking.
Correct.
BVM on him, and then it sounds like you place the leads on him. Is that right?
I believe so.
And then can you just kind of walk us through what the treatment was from there, and then we can go back to this, or if this helps you, please.
We can talk about it either way. Once we're managing his airway with the BVM, we get him on the monitor. I note an initial rhythm, which is concerning for me. It's irregular. It starts out slow, increases. We have an underlying atrial rate at close to 200, but we only have QRS complexes sporadically. The monitor, I think it's important to note, is much smaller. Can you scroll to page 5 of 9? So this is our first rhythm we see, so the pads are placed on. Initial rhythms at 11:37:32, and we arrived at the patient's side at, I believe, 23:34. So in the time it took to remove the clothing, place the pads, aggressively manage the airway, now we have the pads on, and this is our first glimpse at what I was feeling prior to this. So the big complexes, the big spikes, that's actually his ventricles. That's when you're feeling a pulse. The small little bumps between, that's his atria trying to fire. And there's an obvious, in this, a disassociation between the two. So his heart's not mechanically or electrically working appropriately. And that is very concerning for me.
And why? What is it? It's concerning for what? How does it affect your treatment?
So it affects my treatment in that I am anticipating a cardiac arrest just looking at this. He's unstable, he's unconscious, he's unresponsive, he's not breathing. We're breathing for him. It's affecting no change. He's not responding positively to our treatments. And I'm watching this, and this looks like deterioration to me as we're further, we gain IV access, we intubate. None of these things have changes. And the patient eventually goes into an asystole, which is a lack of any electrical output, and we start CPR.
Okay. Maybe we can go back to the first page again there. And then how long did you perform CPR on Mr. Ellis, if you recall?
Roughly 40 minutes.
Okay, so we were looking at the fourth paragraph, I believe, about sinus rhythm deteriorating into bradycardia, asystole, and PEA. Is that what you were just looking at in terms of the initial rhythm?
Correct. So on the small monitor, which has very little detail, I believe this to be a sinus rhythm, though irregular. Deteriorates and slows, which is bradycardia, and asystole. And the only further rhythms we see throughout the cardiac arrest event are either asystole, PEA, or we had one run of what's called VTAC that we then defibrillated. And I believe that was a torsades, it's a polymorphic ventricular tachycardia, and you can see that on page 8 of 9.
And what time was that?
That was at 12:02 a.m.
All right, so that after you've been working on it
Correct.
for some period of time. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about you said the rhythms after that were just asystole and PEA, and then it sounds like you gave him some other treatments. Is that right? What other treatments did you give him?
Correct. Pharmacological interventions, epinephrine, we gave approximately 7 times. We gave bicarb to try to reverse any acidosis in his system, and lidocaine because of the torsades, the polymorphic VTAC that we defibrillated.
And it looks
looks like you also put an IV in him, is that right?
Correct. In order to give those medications, you need IV access. And in addition to that, there were some fluids given to flush behind each of these so that they can get into the circulatory system and be utilized.
And then your next line after that indicates no changes, and I think you said earlier, is that no changes in response to any of these treatments?
Correct. An ample amount of epinephrine, the bicarb, the Lido, and CPR for 40-plus minutes. There were no positive changes.
And so Mr. Ellis, how do you then pronounce Mr. Ellis or decide to cease CPR?
Correct. So we've exhausted our ability to resuscitate. There is no change. I contact Madigan and I talk to a doctor, and the doctor confirms with my assumption or my interpretation of the events, and my opinion is echoed in his opinion, and we reach the conclusion that everything was performed up and into our capabilities, and we call a time of death.
And what time was that they called?
0:12.
So 12 a.m.
Correct.
Oh,
12:12.
12 a.m.
So midnight 12. Yeah.
Okay. All right, I want to ask you about, you said on here you put your impression, cardiac arrest secondary to excited delirium. Can you tell us, is it your job to determine cause of death of somebody?
No, I'm not a medical examiner nor a doctor. I have my paramedic certification and 20 years of experience in seeing these things, and the narrative in that he was agitated, excited, under the influence of some sort of substance, a stimulant, I don't know. His going limp and not responding further, and the subsequent cardiac arrest is what leads me to this conclusion. So this is my understanding of the events and everything that I tried, and the summation of it, of what I believe to have transpired that night.
But in terms of what you just described about the information, was that information you personally observed or something you received from TPD?
It's both subjective and objective.
Okay. And what part is objective?
So the objective are the findings that I found. His cardiac output is concerning. The torsades is concerning. There's several things that are concerning.
Did you ever observe any of the behavior that was being reported?
No, as I stated, I was on scene after the fact, and he was unconscious, unresponsive for the duration of our.
Okay. So were there any, in terms of your conclusion that was excited delirium, other than what you observed in terms of what you were talking about with the life path, any other observations of behavior by Mr. Ellis that would reach that, that would contribute to that conclusion?
Not having personally observed his behavior, the answer would be no.
All right, and in fact, I want to take you back and ask you about a few pictures from the scene. If you could take a look at what's been marked and admitted as 171. It'll come up on your screen. All right, and it's helpful, maybe you can step down here. Well, actually, maybe you can stay there, and I'll just indicate. You can see to the left side of this photograph a yellow item. Do you have any memory as to what that is, or would that be consistent with?
It appears to be a piece of clothing that has been cut and removed from the individual.
Can you just explain to the jury kind of what you do as the fire department when you show up and need to treat somebody quickly?
Somebody in this state, we need to have access to their entirety of their body to see if there's anything that we can find, fix, any immediate life threats. So these things are removed, they're cut off and discarded. So we have access to the patient.
All right, if you could take a look at what's been marked and admitted as Exhibit 173. And with respect to this photograph, Lieutenant Wilson, can you just tell us, you mentioned there was a bag of BBM, and it looks like there's some other medical intervention. If it's helpful, you can step down on this one and show us, what would have been done by the fire department.
Correct. I will do that. With my pointer.
There you go.
So, do I need a microphone?
I think we can hear you okay.
Okay. So from head, right, working distally. You can see the BVM, that's what I've been describing. He has an endotracheal tube here that goes into his mouth through his vocal cords and into his trachea. That's what we use to isolate the airway to prevent any sort of aspiration during the event. This is a tube tamer. This holds the tube in place. These are the EKG leads, and I believe there's 2 more somewhere down here. So those are the 4 that give us that view from different angles into the heart. These are the pads. They're what you see, but these are the sticky version. They don't come off relatively easily. This is an IV. I believe it's an 18 gauge IV in his left AC vein.
Okay, you can take your seat again. Can you explain to us what's the difference between the big pads and the little pads that are on his extremities, the 4?
I believe I just did. The 4 leads are the ability for us to look at different angles of his heart, and the 2 pad leads give us the ability to treat electrically, to defibrillate, to pace, to shock him out of rhythms.
Okay, so the smaller ones, you're initially able on the machine that you're talking about, LifePak 15.
Correct.
That's where you're able to see the electrical rhythm of his heart.
Correct. We can see it through all of them. It's just you only get one view, and it's a small view through the pads, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. Can you tell us that you said that you did attempt to shock him one time, is that correct?
We did. There was 1 defibrillation.
And what time was that?
The defibrillation occurred at 12:02:20, I believe.
All right. And why only the one time that you attempted to defibrillate him?
That was the only rhythm that was appropriate for defibrillation.
And can you just explain to us what you mean by that?
We shock rhythms such as atrial fibrillation or VTAC. We don't shock flatlines. We don't shock pulses or electrical organized activity. We simply shock irritability in the heart.
Okay, so prior to the 12:02, there wasn't anything on the LifePak that was showing a shockable rhythm, is that correct?
Correct. This was the only shockable rhythm.
Now, you said that CPR was performed for some 40 minutes or so. Do you recall who all performed CPR?
There were multiple individuals that performed CPR. We follow the AHA's ACLS algorithm for CPR. And every 2 minutes you rotate providers because people get tired. And as you get tired, your ability to compress the chest and maintain that level of perfusion goes down. So you're effective in the middle of that 2 minutes and you taper off. So we trade out providers, keep people fresh, give them a time to take a break, and then they cycle back in. Fire personnel provided CPR. TPD officers provided CPR. Everybody was there to attempt to make a difference for this individual.
Do you know which TPD officers or how many TPD officers performed CPR?
I do not.
And you said it took a little bit for the other vehicle to get there? The other
Correct.
support? But when those folks arrived, did they assist in terms of performing CPR?
They did.
Lieutenant Wilson, were you, Mr. Ellis was not obviously transported to a hospital. Can you just explain to the jury why that occurred?
Why he was not transported?
Yeah.
Mr. Ellis went into cardiac arrest, and our practice, which is the best practice, is to treat this event as aggressively as possible, because the best chance this individual has is for us to perform CPR at the greatest of our ability. And if we were to try to move him or transport him, our threshold for effective CPR decreases exponentially. We have all of the pharmacological interventions on site. We have the ability to intubate and take his airway, maintain and breathe for him on site. We have the personnel to perform this event on site. So our practice is to run the cardiac arrest as found, as is, if the situation deems safe and appropriate. And so that's what we did this night. Mr. Ellis not responding positively to those treatments resulted in us calling a time of death and pronouncing him at the scene. At that point, we turn the body over to PD, released to the ME, et cetera. I don't know. I have an idea of what happens afterwards, but that's not within my scope. So,
So once the time of death is called and you've been given permission by the doctor to cease efforts, it sounds like you just leave Mr. Ellis's body at the scene and leave, is that right?
correct. We leave everything intact, all of our interventions. Those need to go back and be confirmed, and it's their scene now. So we maintain the integrity of that scene and leave things as is.
Do you recall what time you would have left the scene of Mr. Ellis?
In my report,
Yes.
there is a time that says in service. So 00:25:35 is when that button is pushed in the rig.
All right, so about 12:25 in the morning.
Correct.
And at that point, did your contact with Mr. Ellis or your involvement in this matter cease?
As far as what?
Did you do anything else with respect to Mr. Ellis that night?
No, that night we were called back sometime later.
Can you tell the jury about that, why you were called back?
Correct. We were called back to obtain a temperature of Mr. Ellis.
Was there anything besides the temperature that you were asked to?
We were also asked to do a blood draw, which I politely declined.
All right, and who was that request made from?
I do not know the individual personally or professionally.
What agency do you know?
I couldn't even recall what agency.
All right, and you said you politely declined to do a blood draw, why is that?
Correct. We had released the individual. We had left the scene. It's no longer my patient. It's deceased. I've never done a blood draw on a deceased individual before. I didn't feel comfortable doing that in this case.
Have you ever been asked to do a blood draw on a deceased individual before?
I have not.
And you said you were also asked to take a temperature. Have you ever been asked to take a temperature of a deceased person before?
I have not.
And did you do that?
We took an axillary temperature, which is essentially under the armpit.
Kind of like what you do with kids?
Right, kids, adult, yeah.
All right. And do you recall what his temperature, when you did that, what time it was?
I do not.
Does your report indicate that at all?
If it is in here and somebody is aware of it, I don't believe it's documented in my report.
Do you know approximately how long it was after you had departed the scene you went back?
I do not.
I think I have just a moment. Take my album. Sorry, I did want to ask you about one other area. Other than Mr. Ellis, were you asked to treat anybody else or evaluate anybody else at the scene?
I was not.
Okay, so you didn't do any, do you know if any other firefighters were or paramedics?
I do not believe, but I do not to my knowledge.
I think that's all I have for right now. Thank you, Lieutenant Wilson.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Fricke.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Lieutenant.
Good morning, sir.
On that, well, in your report that you've been referencing here, you again indicated that Mr. Ellis had died by cardiac arrest secondary to second delivery.
Correct.
I mean, do you typically in your reports put a cause of death for those people who have passed?
We do.
Okay, and is that standard practice and for what you do?
It is.
Okay. And so you said that I think that's both based on objective and subjective findings, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the objective finding would be what?
My findings.
And those, again, in this case, would be what?
In relation to excited delirium being the cause of cardiac arrest?
Actually,
Okay.
cardiac arrest and excited delirium.
Okay, so cardiac arrest because his heart stopped and we failed to resuscitate him. That is the ultimate cause of his passing, his cardiac arrest, and my belief is that this was an excited delirium event because of the presentation I see when I see him. He's unconscious, unresponsive, has no respiratory drive, or has some respiratory drive but deteriorates into apnea, and also the rhythms I see throughout. The initial rhythm gives me concern. You have the atria attempting to fire at an extremely high rate, but you only have these complexes occurring sporadically. And also the torsades, which we defibrillated. So once we were able to somewhat attempt to perfuse his cardiac tissue, it's now in an irritated rhythm known as torsades. It's a polymorphic ventricular tachycardia, and we defibrillated that. From my EKG screen, I'm unable to go beyond that in this event.
And did you indicate in past interviews that he was also appeared to be very sweaty?
The condition of his skin is secondary in my assessment. I'm more concerned with his breathing and his cardiac output.
Sure, and I understand that. But
Right.
did you recall indicating that he did appear to be very sweaty at the time?
Right.
Upon the scene?
I state he's cool and clammy. It's a March night. It's very cold. I believe my hands were actually cold this event.
Okay.
So the temperature and the level of moisture on his skin is not something that I've committed to an independent recollection.
Okay. And the temperature that you ultimately took, you don't, I think you mentioned, you don't claim that to be a very accurate temperature.
Correct. It's post-mortem, sometime later. I don't know the exact time. But being able to obtain a core temperature, but that's just not something I'm comfortable doing in the middle of the street on 96th and Ainsworth.
Now, you indicated when you arrived on scene that Mr. Ellis wasn't taking adequate breaths to sustain life.
Correct.
And you're trained, of course.
Correct.
As you indicated. That may not be visible to an untrained person, is that fair to say?
That
Calls for speculation.
That may not be visible to an untrained person.
Calls for speculation.
Overall, you may answer.
correct. Somebody who is not trained to medically assess somebody would not have the ability to assess their breathing because they don't know what to look for and how to evaluate that and what that actually means. So being trained appropriately allows us to very quickly note and treat aggressively.
Okay. And did you have any indication from, as you walked to the scene, that the officers who were present at that time were aware of that situation from those officers?
I couldn't speculate on that.
That's fine. You indicated when you walked to the scene and saw him there, he was, you mentioned agonal breathing.
Correct.
And what is, for purposes of when you see that or hear it, what are you listening for?
Listening for?
What is agonal breathing?
Agonal breathing is a slow, irregular, perhaps shallow breathing.
It's not a snoring, is it?
No, those would be sonorous respirations.
Okay, so it has, does it have any particular noise when a person has agonal breathing?
No.
Okay.
It could if there's something obstructing their airway and the volume of which allows that to be heard and projected, but in this case there were no audible noises.
Right. And you indicated, of course, as you mentioned a couple times, died of cardiac arrest, secondary to sudden delirium. You also indicated that he was hypoxic. All right? Not in your report, but in your statements.
Right. I think it goes without saying if somebody's heart isn't beating adequately and they're not breathing adequately, they're going to be hypoxic.
And you found no indication that the hypoxia that you mentioned was caused by his position that he was in, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And when you said that, what do you mean by that?
I mean, the position that I find him in, if he had the ability to breathe on his own, he would have been.
Okay. So
Or should have been, I should say.
Okay. And also when you came up to him, he had a spit hood on.
Correct.
If I understood correctly, you indicated when you came upon the scene the spit hood was below his nose and his lower
Correct,
part-
covering below his nose and his chin.
Okay, was it covering his mouth?
That's, yes,
Okay, I mean, it's a spit hood, obviously. I get that.
obviously. Yeah.
Was anyone doing CPR at that time when you came upon the scene?
They were not.
Okay. So he would have been, assuming he was able to breathe on his own, when you came upon the scene, you certainly could breathe through his nose, is that right?
Correct. In my professional medical opinion, I do not believe that the spit hood was inhibiting his ability to breathe. And that's further combined with my findings of the airway as I go to intubate. I notice a moderate amount of secretions and no blood. So there's nothing in his airway further that's inhibiting him to breathe.
And that's one of the first things you check on, right?
Right, we clear the air. It's the air, circulation, airway, breathing.
And the use of the spit hood, that's not an uncommon thing that you see.
It's a very commonly used piece of equipment in the medical industry.
And does the fire use it yourselves?
We do.
And what's the purpose of it?
The purpose is to keep patients' bodily fluids to themselves and not transmit them to us.
And that's true you've seen it used by officers as well in the
I have.
times you've been called out to the scene? And doctors, the hospitals,
Absolutely.
and obviously again.
And ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you saw nothing inappropriate in how this particular spit hood was being used when you came upon the scene, is that right?
That's correct.
And everything to see appeared to be appropriate?
That's correct.
And just for the record, you don't know the officers who are charged in this case, right?
I do not personally know them.
And most of the officers, if not all the officers you deal with in your profession, it's a professional relationship, right?
Correct. We have a professional working relationship with TPD.
Okay. And again, I just want to be clear on the amount of secretion that you saw within the spit hood. You said that was a moderate amount.
I didn't observe the amount of secretions in the spit hood or on the spit hood. I'm simply noting what I note in his airway.
Okay. Now, you indicated you've been interviewed on a couple different occasions, two by the state, or I guess one by State Patrol and one by the Attorney General's office, is that right?
That's correct.
And then a third time by the defense, you made yourself available.
Third time.
Okay. During those interviews, I think you indicated as far as what you witnessed, TPD officers who were present were acting appropriately.
Correct.
And that included on how they were dealing with Mr. Ellis from what you observed, is that correct?
Correct.
And you saw nothing inappropriate in their dealings with
I did not.
it. And when you came upon scene and wanted the restraints removed, that was done accordingly, is that correct?
It was.
Okay. With any hesitation?
Other than the several seconds it took for them to express concern in removing the restraints, we echoed that there was no concern now, and it was done.
Okay, and then immediately at that point?
Correct.
Okay. And that was a very brief conversation, it sounds like?
Yes.
Now, again, in the spit or in the airway passage, there was no vomit in the airway passage. Right?
There was not.
No food particles, which I guess would be consistent with vomit to some extent. Is that right?
From my upper airway observations, there was no emesis, which is vomit, in the airway.
Okay, and just a very small trace of blood.
In my report, I note no blood,
Okay.
but I believe in one of my depositions I said trace blood.
Yeah, which would not have had an impact on his breathing. Is that correct?
Correct.
During one of the interviews, I think it's the second interview you had with the state, and Dr. Clark is part of that interview, is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Was that unusual?
That was highly unusual.
And why was it highly unusual?
It was an individual who, in my opinion, was a part of this case or this interaction with this individual, and it was unusual to see this individual on the other side of the table essentially doing the interview
And did you were you uncomfortable with him and his participation?
We were uncomfortable prior to the interview even starting. We considered not doing the deposition, but ultimately we thought it appropriate to proceed.
And did you get the feeling he was trying to change your opinions as to what you observed at the scene?
His feeling doesn't matter. He can say anything in particular that Dr. Clark might have said to him about it.
Okay. Did he say during the course of did he participate in the interview
He did.
and ask questions during the interview?
He did.
Okay. And during the course of that interview, the questions he asked, did you feel, based on the questions that were asked, that he was trying to change your position as to what you observed when you came to the scene?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Did he ask you questions you felt were inappropriate?
I think Dr. Clark asked questions pertaining to the event to further clarify his understanding of it. At times, he asked questions that were very lengthy and gave medical opinions prior to me answering the questions.
And did you change your opinion based on the questions he asked?
I attempted to answer the questions as appropriately as I could. There were times when I felt like we were talking in circles and that I was not being understood.
All right. Okay. Now, on your finding in your report that sentence, cardiac arrest secondary to excited delirium, is that something you found in the past?
I've seen excited delirium in the past.
Okay. It's not uncommon as far as in your experience?
These acute agitated states are not uncommon with the amount of drug use that individuals are consuming now, and they don't know exactly what they're consuming, and we see individuals OD every day at work now.
You come across a lot of overdoses?
Every day.
From all kinds of drugs?
From what we believe to be opiates to opiates mixed with stimulants. So once we remove the opiate, now they're under the influence of an unknown stimulant, and we now have that issue to deal with, which we now have to treat as excited delirium because they're incoherent and combative.
And including methamphetamine overdoses?
Correct.
And certainly a person who's suffering or using methamphetamine combined with a heart condition, it makes it a challenging situation for you folks to bring them back, I guess.
Correct. With excited delirium, once it progresses to cardiac arrest, the odds of resuscitating them are next to zero.
And I just want to be clear, in your report you said he was supine on his back, right?
Correct.
You indicated in some of the interviews, as you mentioned, that you recalled that he may have been on his side as well. I mean, do you remember if he was on his side? Obviously in your report it's on his back, but do you have a recollection that he may have been positioned on his side as well?
Correct. So he's more or less supine on the ground. He's slightly to his left, is my recollection. But more or less supine, as it's denoted in my report.
All right. And then no indication of, at least outwardly, major signs of trauma you indicated?
Correct. That's a concern. We check for that. There's no significant outward signs of trauma that I am able to observe.
And when you say outward signs of major trauma, what are you referring to specifically?
I'm referring to obvious fractures, obvious major contusions or major bleeding, any sort of thing that would inhibit his ability to breathe on his own or function, any blunt, obvious signs of blunt trauma or penetrating trauma, any sort of major head trauma.
And none of that was present?
It was not.
Okay. One moment here.
Mr. Oster?
Morning, Lieutenant, how are you?
Good morning, sir.
I think you started in response to Ms. Eek's questions, indicating that TPD, Tacoma Police Department, actually requested aid once there was a detainment. Did I understand that correctly?
That's my understanding of it.
Okay, and I think what you expressed during direct examination was that that's not unusual, that any time that you're responding to an altercation between a citizen and police, that individual has to be restrained so that you're safe in treatment. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair to say.
And I think that you characterized what you observed upon going to treat Mr. Ellis in this case was, I wrote down, typical was your word.
As far as
him being restrained.
correct, yes.
Meaning, when necessary, when you respond to a situation like this, you would see an individual with handcuffs on in a restrained position, right?
Correct. Somebody who's been overly combated or is not following commands or is aggressive towards officers, this individual needs to be restrained.
Okay. And in here, your report 24 that Ms. Eakes had up on the screen, you said ×4. Does that mean hands and feet?
Correct. 4 extremities
Okay.
×4.
And that would be typical if an individual was restrained such that all 4 extremities had to be restrained.
Correct. If somebody's kicking or using their legs as a focal point to move around, that's when we see the hobbles deployed.
And so nothing unusual about the presentation of Mr. Ellis, given the information that you had when you arrived on scene.
Correct. The restraint was appropriate for what I believed or what was told to me.
So let's talk about that. Your report indicates that you had contact with several officers before treatment of Mr. Ellis.
Correct.
And I think Ms. Eakes asked you if you knew how many, you don't have a specific number.
I do not.
But do you recall, actually, can I have Mr. Collins in it? Have you ever seen Mr. Collins before? Have you ever seen him on scene?
I do not. I apologize.
That's okay. Is it possible that Mr. Collins was the first person that contacted you when you arrived?
I do not know.
Okay. But you do know that the person who contacted you provided you information about Mr. Ellis attacking the vehicle, right?
For the record, I'm reviewing my... Yes, I did provide that information. Somebody provided me with that information, and I noted it in my report.
And they also provide you information that Mr. Ellis was combative when they attempted to restrain him, right?
That's correct.
And that he exhibited extreme strength.
That's correct. Very strong is what I put in quotations.
Okay. And a suggestion that you might, in treating Mr. Ellis, be about to encounter someone who's exhibiting excited delirium.
Correct.
Okay. And that information was given to you from one of the officers that was on scene before getting to Mr. Ellis.
That's correct.
Don't know if it was Officer Collins.
I don't know.
Okay. If I understood your report and testimony, he's in the supine position, but may have also been on his side at some point. Can you elaborate on that for us?
I think I'm trying to describe his position. So he's more or less on his back, but slightly to his left. So somebody has to be holding his upper extremities from behind. And so to do that, more or less, you're elevated. You can't, unless, does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
And the reason I ask you is because his hands are still restrained behind his back, right?
Correct.
And so if he's laying on his back, he's going to be off center one way or the other. Because
He's going left or right, and the officer is on his right behind him.
Okay. And also, do you recall whether his ankles were affixed with the hobble to his restraints?
So I do not recall the hobble being attached to the cuffs. I didn't have that vantage to see through him.
Okay.
But for that to be the case, he would be extremely contorted for that to be a possibility. And that is not something that stands out in my mind.
Okay. All right. So you don't have like an independent recollection of him being in a position consistent with that?
Correct. That's something that would stand out in my mind.
Understood. Thanks, sir. Now, with regard to the spit sock, in both your interviews with the Washington State Patrol and the Attorney General's office, you were not concerned about the application of the spit hood at all, were you?
I was not.
And I think you made it clear to Dr. Clark, we'll talk about that in a second, that was not of any concern to you because you had actually used it on many occasions
Correct.
and would not have prevented obstruction of the airway necessary to breathe in this case.
Correct.
But Dr. Clark kept asking about that in that interview, right?
Repeatedly.
In fact, Dr. Clark controlled that entire interview, didn't he?
I'm going to object, that's argumentative.
Well, you can rephrase it if you want. I don't think it's argumentative. It is asking for a characterization. He can agree with it or not. Or you can reword the question. It's up to you.
I feel
Go ahead. You want to say?
I feel that Dr. Clark's medical opinions on the matter were very apparent in the interview, and I was made aware of them, and I felt that his line of questioning was targeted towards that.
Goal-directed questioning, right?
I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds appropriate.
Right. The way that interview actually started, Ms. Eek started the interview, right?
That's correct.
And Dr. Clark actually took over, right?
He did.
And in fact, interrupted the process of the interview to suggest to you what his opinions were.
Correct. He made a statement about at what point did I believe brain death had occurred. I told him that that is outside of my scope, nor would it impact my treatment modality.
In fact, he introduced brain death as you're describing what you're seeing and suggested maybe that's what was happening, or he was already brain dead at the time,
Correct.
despite what you were telling him.
Correct.
Just so I understand, Lieutenant, when you arrived, you did detect a pulse on Mr. Ellis?
We absolutely had a pulse.
Okay. If I understand your direct examination, that you described, I think, as a weak, and use another word. I didn't know that.
Thready.
Thready?
Thready, like thready. It's another way to describe weak.
Okay. And so it was lessening as you were there?
Correct.
Very rapidly?
It appeared so.
You described it, I think, in your interview with Dr. Clark as hypotension, potentially?
Yeah, a profound hypotension.
What is that?
It's when your heart's still beating, but it's not able to push that circulatory volume to the point where a good palpable pulse is present.
And do you often see that in individuals with heart disease?
Heart disease plays a major role in cardiac output.
And are you aware that Mr. Ellis had a dilated heart?
I was not aware of his prior medical conditions.
Is what you found with regard to the pulse consistent with somebody suffering from a dilated heart and cardiac arrest associated with that?
Correct.
I'm going to object to its lack of foundation and calls for speculation.
Overruled. The answer stands.
I didn't hear the answer.
I said correct. Somebody with the ability to have adequate cardiac output, somebody suffering from heart failure, will deteriorate if there's, yeah, absolutely. When stressed, the potential for that to occur is higher than that of a normal healthy heart.
Right, so in a given situation, if somebody with a dilated heart has a toxic level of methamphetamine in their system and then exerts significant energy, you might expect to see what you found here.
That's my understanding of it.
It's noon, I don't know if we want to break now. I got a little, like probably 10 more minutes.
Okay, we'll take our break. Ladies and gentlemen, we take our afternoon recess at this point, or noon recess. Please be back by 1:15. Please do not discuss the case among yourselves with anyone else. Thank you.